Now, is Europe starting to play dirty tricks over Brexit? A couple of reports indicate that 2018 might bring with it new tactics by the European Union, specifically but not exclusively over business after Brexit. Joining me to discuss is Labour MEP Mary Honeyball and Dan Dalton from the Conservatives. Mary, the reports we're referring to is stuff like the British Chambers of Commerce has told the FT that firms and universities are now suffering negative treatment, UK firms and universities, when bidding for contracts and collaboration and funding. And also that UK businesses, Brussels has been writing to UK businesses, warning them to prepare for the possibility of a no deal in Brexit 2019. So sort of slightly, you could argue, underhand tactics in terms of Brexit. Is that a fair thing to do, or do you think that's a little bit provocative?
I wouldn't say it's underhand. I mean, I would say it maybe isn't helpful at this stage in the process. The thing is that we don't know, and the EU is entitled to feel that it doesn't know, and there is still a lot of talk in the UK, and indeed by members of the government, that we may crash out without a deal. I absolutely hope that doesn't happen, but I don't think you can blame the EU for taking this on board, because it is being said by members of this government.
I mean, part of a negotiation is good faith and having a good relationship with your negotiating partner, and to some extent trust. Reports such as this, you know, negative treatment for UK firms and universities just because they're the UK, arguably is going to be, from the EU end, signifies a slightly more abrasive tactic in terms of getting what they want out of these negotiations.
These are negotiations, and this is what tends to happen at certain stages. I mean, I think actually so far, on the whole, the EU has been very straightforward. The EU has said it's united in where it's going, and it has maintained that. It's maintained an incredible degree of unity, and I think on the whole has been pretty straightforward with Britain. The EU did make it possible to move to the second stage of the negotiations by saying there was sufficient progress, and in doing that was prepared to more or less overlook issues like the Irish border. So I think
it was also convenient for them as well to move on. And
that maybe or may not, but nevertheless they did that, and I think we have to believe still that the EU is entering this in good faith.
Okay, Dan, still entering it in good faith. David Davis, of course, has been not particularly impressed by some of the moves by the EU, particularly towards UK businesses and firms, and in financial services to UK international banks and financial services companies. What's your take on these kind of reports?
Well, I mean, first of all, the David Davis letter was before the agreement that we had in December, and I think the atmosphere was very different at that stage. But I think the EU particularly is taking quite a hard position, not just on UK firms, but also on European firms. And I'll give you an example for this. I mean, the European Union is telling German car companies that German cars built in German factories will not be able to be sold in Germany after March 2019 because they have British type approvals. Similarly, Europeans that have qualifications from British universities will lose recognition of those qualifications in Europe. Now, these are negotiating stances that is hurting Europeans in Europe. So I think the Commission negotiating stance is harsh. I think it's also a bit all over the place at the moment, and I think it's actually a first negotiation before you go into the real negotiations. I don't believe those positions will stand because they will also hurt Europe just as much as they will hurt us.
And you've just described it, these kind of positions that you just mentioned, they're fundamentally hurting European citizens who are not, you know, in this power bubble where the negotiation is taking place. What would be the point of that? What would be the point of actually...
I mean, the Commission principle is that certificates or type approvals or qualifications that are issued by non-EU countries, i.e. third countries, should not be recognised in the EU. And that's a position they're taking at the start of the negotiations with the UK, which will be a third country after we leave the EU. So it's consistent from that point of view. The repercussions of it on European industry, on European individuals, are bad. I mean, they're bad. I mean, the car example is quite interesting because a British car built in the UK could be sold in the domestic market in the UK, but a German car built in Germany couldn't be sold on their own domestic market because of these certifications. And I think, I don't believe this will hold as a position from the Commission, but it's an example of why they're taking a very black and white view of certification going forward.
And in terms of what the Theresa May Conservative government should be doing, should this be something where you just rise above it, just going, if the EU wants to play those tactics, that's fine? Or should, to put it bluntly, if the EU wants to play slightly more unofficial letters to businesses, giving negative treatment to UK companies just because they're from the UK, should the UK be also doing the same?
No, I think the UK has been very clear and should be very clear that we want a deal that addresses these issues, so cars with British type approvals can still be sold in Europe post-Brexit, and European type approvals can be sold in the UK. We're coming forward with those proposals, and I'm pretty confident that once we actually get to the free trade discussions, this will start moving.
Okay. I think what's really interesting about what Dan is saying is just how complex all this would be. That's one small but important, but one detail. I've been working this morning on another detail, which is international treaties and obligations. I mean, for instance, one of the things I've been doing is the Marrakesh Treaty, which allows books in Braille to be freely distributed to blind people. Now, this is one of about 745 international treaties, which will have to be negotiated possibly, but certainly re-signed if and when we leave, which is a massive undertaking in itself. And these are just two examples that we're putting forward, very, very many. So this is going to be a time-consuming and difficult process.
I mean, the example you gave there, it's hard to dispute the value in something like the Braille distribution, and it's hard to see why there would be problems in terms of cooperation between the UK and EU on policies like that and regulations like that.
It's not the cooperation so much that is that if and when we cease to be in the EU, the treaties will cease, and the way it's framed in the EU withdrawal bill is that this will be dealt with under what have been known as the Henry VIII powers. So they will have to each individually, all these 700-odd treaties, will have to be dealt with in some way. It's not a question of the content, it's a question of re-ratifying them, which is going to be a long and complicated process. And Dan's just been talking about what he's been talking about in relation to car parts. My point is that these are just two examples, important ones, but examples out of thousands and thousands of similar ones which are going to have to be dealt with.
So just to bring it back to the reports, for a UK audience reading this, for someone who reads the papers and sees something like this, where it seems that the EU is ramping up a gear in terms of these negotiations and wanting to get what they want out of it, what should we expect from people who spend at least part of their lives in the European Parliament, in European politics? Is this something the UK should be taking seriously, or is this something which is just the rough and tumble of negotiations and I wouldn't think much of it?
Well, look, I mean, in my experience in EU negotiations, what happens at the start, you have two sides with completely different views, red lines that they won't move from. You get into a room, you start negotiating, nothing moves very quickly, and then suddenly with a deadline looming, everything suddenly moves. Late night meetings, everyone comes out at 3 o'clock in the morning at the last moment with a deal. And I think I haven't seen anything in these negotiations to suggest that that isn't going to happen. That's what happened in the withdrawal discussions in December. I suspect that that's what's going to happen over the next couple of years as we try and negotiate all of these things which Mary's referring to as well.
Mary?
I don't think it'll work like that. I've also been in negotiations here. We do this on legislation frequently. And you're basically all starting from a similar premise. You might have differing views on it, but it's all around essentially the same thing. The problem we've got with this is that the UK and the EU are a very long way away on important things. And it was possible to do a midnight fudge or 4 o'clock in the morning fudge with the December moving to the next stage. But you can't keep doing that. There's got to be something coming together and something which can be properly agreed and is firm from both sides. And I just think we're a very, very long way away from that. And I'm not at all certain that will happen.